Hello everyone, Leif Reed here, and today we have Fear and Trembling by Soren Kierkegaard. I believe that's how you pronounce it. Fear and Trembling is a very relatively short book, or really it's an essay, and Kierkegaard was a 18th century Danish philosopher who was considered an Enlightenment thinker, but at the same time wrestled with spirituality and religion, and also searching for meaning in the Enlightenment age and how it corresponded to Christianity. And so he more strikes me as a more of a Christian philosopher than a purely secular Enlightenment era. Because ultimately he leads with the conclusion that religion is necessary, or spirituality is necessary in some aspect. And you might be confused by what exactly this image is. And this is the famous painting by some guy, I forget who. But what it's depicting is, this is Abraham sacrificing Isaac in Genesis. And this is the main story in which Kierkegaard bases his work, Fear and Trembling, on, and I'm fairly certain this is where we get the expression leap of faith from, because that's ultimately is the solution to the existential problem. It's funny, before I forget, I should note that in the way Kierkegaard uses existentialism in this book is a German word, existenz, and apparently, according to Evola, which I just covered, that Kierkegaard's existenz, that German phrase of existentialism, is more similar or more nuanced in that it is a essence of a yin and yang, that the angst of being comes from a point of purposeness and purposelessness, of being all there and all nothing, of being all happy and all sad. It's this sense of these dialectically opposed emotions and moods and ideas that make up the existential feeling that results in angst, that we're not sure, and because we're not sure, we're so sure, and because we're so sure, we're not sure, and it becomes the nature of faith. Anyway, this is an excellent, very short, but excellently written book by Soren. What strikes me about it is that you can tell there is a spiritual essence to the work, because at certain points it feels almost like poetry, that he can't logically describe the feeling, and he has to resort to these poetic notions in order to drive his point across. And so I just finished rereading this, and what is the point of Fear and Trembling? Fear and Trembling is the mode in which not only Isaac finds himself, obviously, in this situation, but Abraham himself. And he just deep dives and psychoanalyzes this one story about Isaac and Abraham, and how, to take in the full context, it's not just that Abraham prayed to God for a child, but it was that he had married Sarah, and she was barren for most of their lives, and at that time they lived till much longer than normal human lifespans. But God came to Abraham and said, "You will bear a son." And this is something that Abraham has always wanted for as long as he can remember. And Sarah, when she's like 70, somehow bears a son, and it's a miracle. It's literally a miracle that he has a son. And it's after this that God tests Abraham's faith. And Kierkegaard refers to him as the father of faith. And he says, you must sacrifice the son I have given you. Even though God said that from you, your seed shall be the seed of nations. It shall be many, many people shall be birthed in your name and shall be successful and over others. And of course, it makes no sense. If you promise me this, how can you expect me to sacrifice my son and result in that if he's gone and if he's dead? And so Abraham has to choose faith in God, that killing the one thing that A, matters most, B, is thought of most, and C, what that he needs to fulfill his own promise to God. He puts faith in God that if you can give me a child at this point and I can sacrifice him, then there's some divine plan and I can give up my faith into you. And I'll get into it, but just again, from the top of my mind, it's so interesting that Kierkegaard calls these revelations or these adaptations of our expectations as spiritual movements, as if we are in some kind of dance. I find that very interesting and accurate. That and he says the two movements that Abraham goes through is one of resignation and one of faith. The first movement of the Spirit is that he says, all right, I have to give up Isaac, I have to give up my son, I have to let go of the one thing I cherish most for God. And the second movement is the faith that something will happen, that something will happen to fulfill his desires and God's desires at the same time. And it's this, and again, the main dialectic that Kierkegaard talks about is the possible and the impossible, the fact that faith in itself boils down to believing in something impossible. And he draws a very interesting conclusion, or a comparison between that of a child or a little girl who believes in, I don't know, the Easter Bunny or something, is that her faith and her belief is based on childlike wonder, that she doesn't understand that in the basis of reality such a thing is not possible. While in Abraham's situation, it is even more powerful as a form of faith because he knows the odds. It's the impossibility. And so he draws this very clear distinction between believing in something while also knowing the odds and not knowing the odds. There's blind faith and there's known faith. And I think the way he describes it is actually through he calls it aesthetics and ethics, where ethics is you know and aesthetics is you don't know. I'm not sure. It's actually a bit of a confusing part of the book, honestly. But it's the idea that in order to believe in something that you know logically is actually probably not possible, takes much more faith and a much wider movement than that of someone who just doesn't understand the probability. But once you understand the probability and you still believe it's possible, that is a kind of faith that is overpowering. That is just, as he says, the strength of the absurd shall win the day. And it's very interesting between childlike belief and adult-like faith. Anyway, I'll read a bit of the book. And of course, he goes into the idea that in order to enter into a mode of faith that is distinct despite the world and its tragedies, you have to leap, or as apparently in the more proper Danish translation, step, a spiritual movement as if it were in a dance. I mean, you could leap in a dance, I guess, but you can also step to a dance. It's a semantic, but the point is that you you feel it in your gut, in your soul. I don't know, but you feel this thing where you resonate the possibility because you know it's such a small chance, and you still step into it despite that. Like a soldier going off to war knowing that he'll probably die, and yet there is the chance that he will come back alive. And there's that chance and that faith in that small infinitesimal chance that keeps him alive. It keeps him going. He also talks a lot about Abraham and the known and the unknown. I guess the deeper context into the Abraham-Isaac story is that he brings Isaac to Mount Moriah to sacrifice him, but he does not tell Isaac, and he does not even tell his wife what he is going to do. He has to bear it all himself in the silence and in the faith that God will see them through. And it all comes up to the very end part of the end point where Isaac asks Abraham, where is the lamb for the sacrifice? Or where is the, where is the, and Abraham simply says that God will provide a lamb, which is telling the truth and also telling a lie. It's that Isaac is the sacrifice, but it works on a literal and metaphorical thing, because eventually what happens is a goat does appear, and then he sacrifices the goat instead of Isaac, and he knows that God sent it. Once God saw the resoluteness of his faith, it's like, hey, you want this covenant thing? You want this thing to work out? The end of the deal is that I need to see that you really believe. I need to see your faith. And I guess it's funny, in a lot of different contexts, the faith in a deal is usually assured with a handshake or a shot of vodka or something, and something very manly and direct like that. But in this case, God, he says, I want you to show me that you're willing to give up something that you love more, that you love me more than your best thing that I gave you, by the way. And it's funny because he also, Soren also draws an analogy between other stories of the tragic hero and how is it really that tragic? He takes, for example, I guess some kind of play based on the Iliad, but not the Iliad itself, where it's a more in-depth look into Agamemnon and how he has to sacrifice one of the slave girls to the gods as repentance for destroying the temple. He also brings up Jehoshaphat or one of the judges from the book of Judges of the Bible, where, and I remember this distinctly, where he prays to God for a victory over the Philistines, and he says, that's fine, but whoever, who was it? He said, whoever comes out of your house when you return is the person you must sacrifice for this victory. And of course, the person that comes out of the temple or out of his house is his young daughter, at which point he breaks into tears and knows what he must do. And again, this all relates back to the fear and the trembling, the fear and the trembling before an almighty power that is above us, and the idea that we need to be, that its love and its power is so great that it can overtake us. He also brings up, he kind of ties it in at the end, but I'll just say it now. Excuse me. The story of Luke 24 or something, but it's the part where, I think it also says it in Matthew, but in Luke it's something like, do not think I have come to bring peace, but a sword and a fire between a man and his brother, his mother, his sister, his family, his society, and himself. because there is no higher love than God, and he who is not willing to bear his cross is not deserving of me. Simply saying that if God tells you to do something and your family tells you no, you're not worthy of God if you allow your love for your family to overpower his own. It's a very challenging, troubling thing. I mean, hopefully your family agrees with whatever God wants you to do, whether it's freeing the Israelites from Egyptian captivity or it's going to war with the Assyrians. But if they don't support it, it's a big choice for you, unfortunately. It also opens up the book with a series of different translations, I believe, and different interpretations of the Abraham and Isaac story. So you get a feel for the differences, the nuances, and so forth. And so he kind of describes the leap of faith, or the step of faith, as almost losing oneself to love. That your faith and your love in this divine thing which has commissioned you to do this thing is so great that you almost lose yourself, that you become possessed by this infinite grace, and you decide to have this love overtake you and overtake the world and the world's materials. And he gives an example here of a lack of unfaith. That's when Moses struck the rock right before they entered the Holy Land, and even though he struck the rock, he did not believe it would yield water. But it's saying that you need to have faith along with your acts in order to justify them. And so it's interesting. It's divided into problemata, 1, 2, and 3, looking at 3 different aspects of the story. One being the knowledge of the act, one being the act itself, and the last one being what is tragedy, and what is the conclusion of, and the meaning of the conclusion. And it's funny, in the 3rd chapter, he goes into a lot of different stories throughout history. He brings up Faust, this story about a merman who seduces a woman, ancient Greek myths, and all these other tragic stories. I think he briefly mentions Oedipus Rex. And honestly, the third problematic chapter in this book is not great. The first 2 chapters are really good, but the third one, he's just drawing up all these stories and these illusions that if you don't know the context, it doesn't matter. So it's kind of all over the place. In the 3rd act, or it's not all over the place. He's just describing. He's like doing a movie review where he starts describing the movie instead of actually like describing the point of it. Yeah, it's funny here. It says it describes the faith as, I can make the great trampoline leap at which I pass over into infinitude. My back is like the tightrope walkers, twisted in my childhood, and so it is easy for me. 1, 2, 3, I can go upside down in existence, but the next is beyond me. For the marvel I cannot perform, but only be amazed at. Yes, if only Abraham, the instant he swung his leg over the ass's back and said to himself, now Isaac is lost, I could just as well sacrifice him here at home. He who loves God without faith reflects on himself, while the person who loves God in faith reflects on God, saying that his actions in the world around him are the product and the essence of God rather than his own. And then this is when he gets very poetic. He goes full on. And yet, yes, it would drive me to fury out of envy, for it would no other reason. And yet this man has made, and is the very moment making the movement of infinity. He drains in infinite resignation the deep sorrow of existence. He knows the bliss of infinity. He has felt the pain of renouncing everything, whatever is most precious in the world, and yet to him finitude tastes just as good as to one who has never known anything higher. For his remaining in the infinite, or in the finite, bore no trace of a stunted, anxious training, and still he has this sense of being secure to take pleasure in it, as though it were the most certain thing of all. And so he describes in detail the spiritual movement of resignation and of giving up one to faith, to giving up to the small chance, to the possibility, even if one should fail, that it is something that holds us to it and allows us to achieve the unachievable and think the unthinkable. Faith, therefore, is no aesthetic emotion, but something for hire, exactly because it presupposes resignation. It is not the immediate inclination of the heart, but the paradox of existence itself. I like that. It's the believing despite and knowing the gods and still persevering in that extent. This movement is one that I make by myself. So what I win is myself in my internal consciousness, which is blessed. To give up the world and simply say that I am myself outside of it, that I shall become faithful in myself and in my God and in my story of existence. And so he talks about the ethical dilemma of a man, trying to kill his own son, and how it relates to a tragic hero. Problem 2, is there absolute duty to God? Is there, are you able to do something? He's saying, once God told Abraham to do this thing, did he just fully submit and said, oh, well, that's what God said, might as well do it here? But it's the faith that God would change his mind. It's a double thing, that you would do something that would make no sense logically because God has promised to you, but you take the leap of faith, the step of faith, that despite doing something that is totally illogical, it will result in something grand and beautiful. And problem 3, was it ethically defensible for Abraham to conceal his purpose from his family? And this is where he brings up a bunch of other stories and references and stuff. But he who loves God has no need of tears, needs no admiration, and forgets his suffering in love. So either is a paradox that the single individual as a particular stands in an absolute relation to the absolute, or Abraham is done for. Essentially, this only works if there is a God in the story. And that's it. Bada bing, bada boom. Existentialism wrapped up and in a nice bow. It's funny, actually, when I was reading this, I had the emotion or the experience that I was listening to a Linkin Park song or something. It was kind of like, like that whole existential angst. Like the essence of angst is that, is this real? Is this not real? I don't know. Knowing and not knowing, this extreme agnosticism, if you will, of being certain and uncertain, and deciding at the end of the day to resign yourself and say, I don't care. I'm going for the higher ground. I'm going for the impossible. I'm going for the improbable because it is a higher goal. I'm going to shoot for the stars. Even though it makes no sense. And it's this resignation of, despite what everyone tells him, whatever he tells himself, he goes for something higher and gambles with his most precious thing. Not because he has no control, but he has such belief in a better, higher future. And I don't know, that's pretty hardcore. And it's the whole essence of, I don't know, maybe Linkin Park or these alt. Another band I listen to is Alex on Fire. That kind of music where it's prog rock of this yearning for truth, this yearning for love, and this feeling that I'm going to pursue it even if the whole world is against me, is pretty much what's in this book. I really didn't expect those two things to mesh together as well as they did, but it really is. I think it encapsulates the modern existential mode that people go through, because nothing is super certain, because things and science changes from day to day. Certainty isn't a thing anymore. That the feeling of believing in one's own truth, or one wanting to pursue the ultimate truth despite the odds, is very, very compelling and a very relatable emotion, even though this was written a couple hundred years ago. But yeah, that is Fear and Trembling by Soren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard. And yeah, not very long at all. Actually, I forgot to mention about half the book is like an epilogue, or rather an introduction, and there also is a short epilogue and then an appendix. So it might be like 100 pages. It's not long, but it is something I did find I had to slow down and actually read line by line, because it wasn't informational. I mean, it was, but it was also metaphorical and almost poetry. With poetry, you can't rush poetry. You have to savor the words and understand and hold that meaning and savor it, because it has that texture to it. And of course, in the third part of this book, the third problematics, where he brings up and has to summarize all these other stories that he assumes we know something about. He's just going through informational stuff, like, oh, and then this happened, and then this happened, right? You right, guys? You remember? And then he goes into analysis. So that really slows it down. It's not as good, but the first two chapters, really, really good. Really cool stuff. It's short. I would very much recommend it. I don't know if you can read something and also listen to prog rock or breakcore or whatever kind of yearning faith music. Faith music is such a weird word because it sounds like Christian music, but it's not that cheesy stuff. It's but it's aiming for God. It's aiming for the Most High despite everything else, and that's what faith is. It's a study of faith, basically. Anyway, that's all I can think of saying right now. I will see you guys later, and as always, keep reading.